great late Milton Friedman always talked about individual choice. You see, as human beings, we are free to think, free to act, and free to choose. And we ought to be, since we can think, we can reason through problems, and we should not rely upon the government to provide for us. You know, we're in a crisis today. We're in a national crisis today, and it's not just one of coronavirus as a pandemic. This crisis is also a crisis of confidence in government. Whether we think government has not stepped up enough or has stepped up too much. Whether you believe that government is capable of handling these crises and therefore should, or government is not and therefore should not. The question we will all have to answer when it is all said and done, after this crisis has abated, and we look back and we say, okay, how did the government handle it? Where do we need to go from here? The question we need to ask is which of these two lessons we are to learn. One, the government didn't do enough. It needs to step it up and provide more for the people so that it can offset any crises like this when they come up, so that it can prevent more crises that may come about. Or, number two, we can't trust the government to do that. We can't rely upon the government to provide for us because it is incapable of doing so. And truly, it should not do so. Because government has a primary responsibility of protecting the rights of the individual. It's one of the themes we've hit hard on this program in our first 35 or so episodes, is that government's role is to protect the rights of the individual, not to simply subordinate it, as we discussed yesterday, to society's interests. Moreover, government all too often causes problems, is the root cause of the problems, not market failure, but government failures. It's what we saw with the 2008 financial crisis, for example, of policies forcing banks to give out loans and incentivizing banks to give out loans to people who wouldn't be able to pay them back, hence the subprime mortgage crisis and the financial collapse. Right now, as far as this crisis pandemic, the federal government and state governments were unprepared in their own way. It is the job of government to provide for a little bit of support in a crisis, but they didn't stockpile the resources that they should have from a national standpoint or from state standpoints, although we were able to see the private market step up and fill the void. But then the government goes in and says the way in which to address this crisis is simply to shut down the economy. And we're going to make it, for the beginning part of the crisis, we're going to make it more difficult for testing to take place because we have regulations and we have one type of test that's allowed in the United States produced by the Centers for Disease Control, the only test. That's how it began, only one test. And it took weeks for the FDA to finally open up to other manufacturers of tests and to allow for antibody testing. We've seen challenges with being able to provide treatments to individuals who have been suffering from COVID-19 because the governments in various states have been getting in the way. So time after time after time, we look at the history of the government, and not only is government unable to address a crisis when it comes about, it often brings about the crisis or sets a framework down, lays some groundwork for a more difficult situation than otherwise would have been, and oftentimes government policies get in the way, impedes opportunity, impedes progress, impedes prosperity through the regulatory state. We're going to be talking a lot today about prescription drugs and unleashing their potential from the FDA and its very stringent regulations and regulatory regime. That is an instance where people's lives have been lost because the government has not allowed a faster process to get potentially life-saving drugs out into the market, or at least making them available to consumers. Time after time after time, government gets in the way of businesses being able to provide more jobs for people, because they up the cost through regulation, making it more difficult, for example, for patients to be treated via telemedicine. It's not this crisis that should be telling us we need to do telemedicine and expand those opportunities and cut the red tape wherever it is, or allow for physicians to be able to practice across state lines. That's not something we should just be waiting for a crisis for. Those are things that should have been done years ago. In fact, those impediments should have been put in place. All too often, as Ronald Reagan cautioned us in his 1981 inaugural address, government is not the solution to our problems.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Wise words from Ronald Reagan, who was always chock full of wisdom about the role of government and the way in which government gets in the way of our lives, of our opportunities, of our success and our prosperity. We must not look at this crisis and say, hey, this means government needs to step up and do more. What can we do to get government to do more? We need to look at this crisis and say, we can't rely on government. Government doesn't know what it's doing. It's incapable of handling these things. The private market is much more efficient at addressing situations. It's not perfect. Companies aren't perfect. Individuals aren't perfect. The market system isn't perfect. But it's much better than command and control. We've tried it for years and years and years in this country with great success. And we need to keep that in mind. Now, today we're going to be focusing on one aspect of this discussion, which is the idea of patient-doctor freedom, especially when it comes to prescription drugs, and the role of government in getting in the way of that doctor-patient relationship, of impeding progress when it comes to medical advancement that could save lives. The history of the U.S. government is one where, for the most part, we cannot rely upon the government to do so many of the things that people might think or want government to do. And it really is something that the founding fathers of this country provided tremendous, they warned us of the limits of government. For example, if you go to Thomas Jefferson, he once said, every government degenerates when trusted to the rules of the people alone, to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves are its only safe depositories. Again, let me read it. Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves are its only safe depositories. In other words, what Thomas Jefferson is saying here is that we cannot be looking simply to the government to provide for the people. We cannot trust the rulers to guide us, to make decisions. We can only trust in the people to do that, because government isn't actually taking into account our own individual self-interests. If you've got an illness, and there is no cure for that illness, but there are treatments that are being tested, and the FDA doesn't want you to try that treatment, you could lose your life when potentially there's a life-saving drug out there because the Food and Drug Administration says, no, we're not good with that drug. We're not going to let you do it. Thankfully, now there's a right to try. We'll talk about that more later on in the program. But the bottom line is that you cannot simply trust rulers who are disconnected from you, politicians who are disconnected from you, the people in Washington, D.C., to provide for you or to care about you and your interests. You're going to look out for yourself and your family much more than bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. Let's go to John Adams talking about power. This is tremendous wisdom from another founding father. Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak, and that it is doing God's service when it is violating all his laws. Listen to that first part. Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak. Vast views. Wisdom, he's saying, that bureaucrats, that politicians, that elites think they have that you do not, as the people. That is the hubris of power he is describing. And then one more John Adams quote I want to share. Let's put this one up on the screen. John Adams, second president of the United States, saying, "Liberty, according to my metaphysics, is a self-determining power in an intellectual agent. It implies thought and choice and power. Liberty meaning that power is in the people. It means that you should be able to think and be free to choose." That comes in all facets of life, and most definitely when it comes to medicine. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.